Davey D, Hard Knock Radio, hanging out with you this afternoon. One of the things I want to talk to you about is what is happening to African refugees on the continent in places like Libya, and even more disturbing, what is going on in Israel. We've been seeing and hearing a lot of stories that African refugees are being mistreated. In fact, we've reported on it in the past. But in recent days, the mistreatment has been ratcheted up a whole lot. We're hearing stories that African refugees have several weeks to get out the country or they'll be jailed for life. We're seeing that the rhetoric and hostility directed at them is unprecedented. And we wanted to find out exactly what is happening in a country that is often held up as a shining example of democracy, the state of Israel. Joining us on the phone line, somebody who's been chronicling this for a number of years, is journalist David Sheen. He's put out a number of videos, reports, has been on our show, and we will play some of the clips from his latest reports that document what is going on. So, Dave, welcome to the show, and let people know what's going on. It seems counterintuitive that a country like Israel, where you're located right now, he's in Tel Aviv, which was formed as a result of people escaping the type of harsh treatment that we just described, would turn around and do this to others who are fleeing dictatorships, torture, all sorts of calamities that, require them to find safe haven. So what is going on?
First of all, thanks for having me, as always, on the show. It's good to be back. The situation here, as you said, I've been reporting on for several years, and it's just getting progressively worse and worse. Seemingly, the reason that it's now situation is exacerbating is because with Trump in power, there's no longer any fear on the Israeli side to do their worst. The government doesn't mind actually violating these international conventions that it itself, as you pointed out, not only has a historical interest in upholding, but actually historically were among the co-authors. Israel co-authored and contributed a great deal to the actual original refugee convention signed in the UN in 1951 in the shadow of the Holocaust. So clearly at that point, at least in people's minds here, it was important. But that was never tested because no refugees ever came to Israel since that time. Of course, many Jewish people did, but they didn't enter as refugees. The government automatically granted them citizenship as Jews. The African refugees were only starting to enter Israel 10 years ago. And at that point, Israel didn't have any border with the African continent. It was just like something you could have just hopped over without too much difficulty. It was just a long, long border. So people, when they're fleeing, whether it's dictatorships in Eritrea, where men and women are required to literally be slaves to their own army for decades, for life, and women potentially, sex slaves, essentially. So the entire country is, considered the North Korea of Africa. So there's, thousands of people are fleeing there every month. You've seen pictures of what's happening to mainly Eritrean. I mean, they're from all over the continent, but that's one of the countries that suffered the worst. And the other main country that the refugees in Israel are from are Sudan. And of course, no one really needs to know, if they don't already know, massive ethnic cleansing. The president of Sudan, charged by the International Criminal Court for war crimes and genocide. So it's very obvious because these people everywhere else in the world, they get refugee status, maybe not 100%, maybe not everyone's honest about why they fled, but 80, 90% of the people from those countries in America, in Canada, in Europe, in Australia, get that status. So why don't they get that status in Israel? If, as you say, Israel is supposedly a champion of democratic rights and champion of refugee rights, and there's several reasons, but the main ones are that they're non-white, non-Jews. We already see how Israel has treated Palestinian people for decades. No one needs to be informed of that in this small short of time we have now. We know this, and we can talk about it at length another time. But those people were the ones who were here when Jews started returning to the land, and those are the people they found here. These are newcomers, the African refugees. So there's no prior conflict with them. What reason could there be for Israelis resenting their presence? And the reason is because, governments of Israel have over the years incited people to think that this is a Jewish state and we can't have non-Jews living here in any significant numbers because they will be a threat. Now, besides the refugee issue, for people who grew up in the Jewish tradition, the entire, the main holiday, the Jewish national holiday, is Passover. And on that holiday, the entire crux of the story of the Passover holiday is that, according to legend, that Hebrew people, Israelite people, were living in Egypt, that they were non-citizens, residents of Egypt. And then the Egyptian Pharaoh said to his ministers, look at those Hebrews. They're multiplying. There's too many of them. Pretty soon there will be a demographic threat to us native Egyptians. So we must crack down on these Israelites. And then the whole narrative of the Passover story of going from becoming slaves and being oppressed. And then, okay. So the point is, this is the whole Jewish national narrative that a foreign leader would say, you are starting to become too numerous and you're, and that entire narrative of Pharaoh is the narrative that the Netanyahu government absorbed and has been, proselytizing to its citizens for years. And this is the result. The result is all kinds of ways to coerce them to self-deport out of the country. At first, Israel didn't want to outright deport them because that would be just a major violation. But now with Trump, there's no need to just use coercion methods. Up until now, the coercion methods were taxing them very significantly, not allowing them to work legally, rounding thousands of them into desert detention centers, inciting racist attacks against them. So there's been all kinds of ways, the idea of making their lives miserable.
Let me just stop there. We're talking with David Sheen. He's in Tel Aviv, well-known journalist, talking about the racism and the attempt to purge Africans out of Israel. I think there's a couple of things I want to pick up on.
Sure.
First, in Israel, they built this very high-tech fence. And that high-tech fence is something that, is being encouraged by the Israeli government for other countries to adapt, mainly Europe, and then, of course, the United States. I want to focus on this for a second because part of what's happening is as African refugees may be forced to leave and head towards Europe, which is experiencing its own wave of white supremacy, so to speak, and has become very xenophobic, Africans fleeing get caught a lot of times going through places like Libya where they are enslaved. And we've seen that. So that seems to be one particular problem where you're seeing this push where the conditions become even worse. So they become enslaved. The second thing is the policies that are being adapted by Israel is being encouraged to be used in other places. So it seems like they're going above and beyond what they're doing there in the country, but it's like, hey, you need to shut it down over there as well. So let's talk a little bit about that, because it seems like Prime Minister or President Netanyahu is going extra hard on this.
You're 100% right. I'm glad you brought that all up. So in recent years, we see ramping up of the Israeli government, the far-right Israeli government, connecting to the far-right parties of countries all around the world, whether it's, their over-the-top love for Trump, even, before he was elected, and praising him. And now it's getting buddy-buddy with the far-right governments in Hungary, far-right governments in Poland, basically the Eastern European countries their own far-right governments are saying the same message, which is we don't want our culture to be tainted by these brown and black people, by these Muslims and Arabs and Africans, and so we're going to close our doors. So Israel is now export not only, as you mentioned, the technology, for example, to build high-tech fences to prevent any refugees from requesting asylum in their countries, but also exporting the ideology, saying we don't have to be embarrassed about our xenophobia. We should be proud of it. This is something we should stand behind, and not be ashamed of. And so that's what we see happening. In last year, we start to see Netanyahu boast. If until last year he only talked about it in Hebrew, he would only really speak in Hebrew to ramp up hatred in Israel towards the African asylum seekers. Now he starts to speak about it in English, saying, Israel is like Europe's last defense against these African Muslim hordes that are coming. And so you should not criticize Israel for its human rights abuses, but rather stand by Israel, praise Israel, and thank it, and essentially, for doing the frontline work. Basically like those people you have in the United States on the southern border, these vigilantes who go and they make holes in the water bottles that people leave behind. So it's the same thing. They're saying now, they're kind of, we're the front lines, we're at the border stopping refugees before they can enter Fortress Europe. And you're absolutely right, what you mentioned earlier about many of these people getting sucked into the slave trade in Libya. That's exactly what happens, because Israel, yes, it's threatening to ramp up the deportation of the 40,000 African refugees in Israel, but it already deported over 20,000, over a third of the community in the last 5 years. When no one else was paying attention, except for a few journalists, like you mentioned, the government kicked out 25,000 African refugees. They said the idea that the government sent them was, we're just going to send them to another African country that agrees to take them in. Now we find out, because human rights groups and governmental NGOs have gone in and interviewed the people who Israel kicked out or deported or coerced to leave. Turns out that many of them, like you said, ended up getting sucked, meaning that they were deported to Africa, but the African country they were deported to, they did not receive rights there, because all of the African continent is itself dealing with a massive refugee problem. So Israel dumps its unwanted refugees in countries that don't have the capacity. Within a couple weeks, they realize they're not getting any status. They don't have the right to work. They don't have the right to live. They don't have anything there. So they quickly realize their only safety is somewhere else. They move from country to country looking for it. And as you said, many of them are either getting sold, tortured, maimed, enslaved in Libya, or they're dying at the bottom of the Mediterranean, drowning in boats trying to get to Europe. That's no small amount of them. So it's not that Israel just deported them and said, well, we don't want these black people, but we've arranged for them to have a safe space in some other country to take them off our hands, so at least our conscience are clear. No, instead of doing that, what it claims it did, what it does is send them right back into this, basically to run the gauntlet between Libya and and Europe, and many people getting tortured and killed in the process.
David Sheen, one of the things that is disturbing in your report is that you said that there was a policy change, and that policy change was to make life as miserable as possible for Africans so that they would leave. And that entailed a whole lot of things, constant harassment by the police, encouraging vigilante groups to go after folks. You showed some of that in your report. So there's a lot going on, and it was really like, make it so that they just don't want to be here. And we can pull the gloves off because Trump is in office. And so Israel, which depends upon so much foreign aid from the United States, no longer feels like they have, as you mentioned, hide this. Being over there right now and understanding this history, understanding that in many ways, when Israelis, Jewish folks were fleeing Germany and fleeing these other countries where Nazism was on the rise, a lot of places did welcome folks in, and we understand, that was a human rights crisis, and of course, why wouldn't we? How is it that folks who have that legacy, which, is still within the lifetime of some people who are there, I mean, we're talking about 60, 70 years ago, how are they able to reconcile their past by taking on this sort of politic that was used against them? And I'm asking this because you said the majority of people in the government went along with this. You showed the picture. They were all standing up going, let's get them out. So how does this happen? I'm just trying to. How does the oppressed become the oppressor?
Psychologically, what has to happen? It's a really important question that you're asking. I've talked about this, how if today my own grandparents who, their entire families were killed in front of them and just barely managed to survive World War II and the Holocaust, they themselves, if they were put up to scrutiny by the same standards that Netanyahu demands of these African refugees, they wouldn't have found shelter. They wouldn't have survived. They wouldn't have been able to get out of Europe. That's certainly a huge slap in the face to Jewish history. How is well? In my mind, one of the main ways that this happened is the way that the Holocaust is explained in Israeli society. I'll tell you a little bit about what I mean for that. Okay, let's start off with actual Holocaust survivors. Today, as you pointed out, there are still some people who survived the Holocaust and, living all over the world and living in Israel. And yet, every single year, and of course, just yesterday was Holocaust Remembrance Day, or the day before that, it was Holocaust Remembrance Day internationally, but Israel has its own day on the Hebrew calendar. So every year on the Hebrew calendar, on Holocaust Remembrance Day, there's articles in the newspaper saying, why is it that it's Holocaust Remembrance Day and over a third of Holocaust survivors in Israel are still living under the poverty line, where people still who survived the Holocaust and survived their whole lives, and still, because the government is holding off in, giving, supporting that community of people towards the end of their life, they have to make decisions. Am I going to pay for the heating bill this month? Am I going to buy food this month? Am I going to pay for medicines this month? These are questions no one should have to ask, at any age, but definitely not in their old age, and definitely not someone who suffered so much of the Holocaust. So, first of all, the point is, in Israel doesn't even care for the actual Holocaust survivors who still survived. The usage of the Holocaust in Israel is super manipulative. It's about one very specific narrative, and it's a nationalist narrative. Instead of the message of the Holocaust being taught to the youth would be, never again for anyone. This is what happens when we allow anti-democratic forces to come into power and to put their ideology into practice. That's not the message at all that Israeli youth get. The message they get is never again for us. The message is we Jews can't trust anyone, and we have to be strong, because if we're not super strong, then this will happen to us again. So the moral of the story is we must be strong and control our own destiny. And to many, that means we can only have Jewish people here, because if there's non-Jewish people, then they'll be able to vote. And then the will of the Jewish people, they will not be able to protect themselves, if they're less than, a massive majority of the population. Of course, this is crazy. The Jewish people are only maybe 2% in the United States, 2% in Canada. And there's no pogroms against Jewish people in Canada or the United States or any of these places. Not saying there's no anti-Semitism. Of course there is. We just saw, a Jewish student being murdered a couple of days ago in the United States. And there's all kinds of examples. But the point is that for the most part, Jewish people live lives without suffering the worst abuses of anti-Semitic incidents that we've seen in other parts of history and other parts of the world. And yet, so how is it possible that they could, apply some of the most horrific policies, send people away, even though if their own grandparents would have received these messages, they would call bloody murder, saying, how dare you abandon these people? Israelis have adopted an us versus them mentality, because the government tells them. And,
wow.
And it's one of the saddest things, right? Because you wouldn't want it to happen. You wouldn't expect it. Of course, Palestinian people will chime in and say, well, what do you expect? They've been oppressing us for decades. How can you be surprised by it? And of course, those are legitimate complaints. But let's say even in that Israeli framework, you can point to, say, well, there's been bad blood. We've had a century of bloodshed, recrimination on both sides. It's not so easy to get past that negative history. Okay, but what are you going to say about Africans? Was there ever a war between Jews and African people and Jews and black people? Did they ever go to war? Was there any oppression going? No.
Right. And that's, and yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, the Palestinian, the brutality directed at Palestinians should be an obvious that one. But in the national narrative, you know, the way Palestinians and Arabs in general are portrayed is that, you know, when they say the conflict in the Middle East, it implies that there are armed Palestinians who are oppressing at various times Jewish folks. And, you know, it's definitely a one-sided situation in terms of what happens when war is waged. So, but it becomes a confusing thing, and I wanted to make sure there's a separation because the narrative of Palestinians is often cited with the word terrorism attached, and then people see those reports and they go, "Yep, that's what it is over there." But you can't say that, as you pointed out, with the African refugees who are fleeing. You can't say that they have underground tunnels. You can't say that they are a party similar to Hamas. You can't say that. Instead, what you have to look at and reconcile with is that this is a country that says it is a shining example of democracy, and now that democracy is needed, we're now seeing the adaptation of, you know, we have to protect our borders and we can't be overrun. And that seems to be rhetoric that is being embraced increasingly by white populations in various parts of the Western world. But let me ask this question. Okay. You talked about anti-Semitism, and it was right here that we saw, and we still see, those who would support a Donald Trump, those who take on this ideology of America first, are not very fond of Jewish folks themselves. I mean, we saw, you know, when folks were in Charlottesville, they were yelling disparaging remarks about Jewish people just as quickly. If you watch some of these TV shows or you get into conversations with the far right, they will talk about Israel being a drain on our money. They will talk about the media being controlled by Jewish folks. So all the stereotypes, the banks being controlled by Jewish folks. So those anti-Semitic stereotypes are very ripe. So how is it that that dance of white supremacy is being courted by the Israeli government when, you know, for the most part, there's not a love for Jewish people by these white supremacists? That's also confusing.
No, you're 100% right. Well, this is just it. Why is Israel running into the arms of the far right? Well, there's a few reasons for that. First of all, you know, let's say let's look at the right-wing economic vision for the world. You know, they'll say, oh, you know, we need to allow, basically corporate wealth is what they support and no restrictions on that. So let's just for 1 second, just look at the economics of it. In Israel, they'll say, oh, you know, the right wing, they'll say, oh, we have to kick all these African people out. But if you go to the Knesset protocols, you'll see that what they say is, once we kick out the Africans, then we need to bring in Filipinos to replace them. Because on one hand, you know, they need people because there's lots of jobs in Israel as a Western country. You know, there's jobs people don't want to do, whether it's waiting tables or street sweeping. And so, you know, it used to be the Palestinians were the ones who did those jobs in Israel for the most part. But since, you know, now there's a lot more tension with Palestinian folk, so the government wants to reduce the amount of Palestinians, so it starts bringing in workers from East Asia, Chinese folks to do construction labor, Thai folks to do agricultural labor, Filipino folks to do to work with old folks and such. So the point is, there are you can call them HR companies, or we can call them glorified slave traders, whatever you want to call them. But, you know, Israel wanted an exploitable labor force that it could get to do its dirty work without having to guarantee them full labor rights. And so until recently, it was the Palestinians. Once they decided we wanted fewer Palestinians, so then they started bringing in East Asians. And now that there's Africans already in the country, there's no one that stands to lose economically from it. There's only one group, those same glorified slave traders who made money off of every East Asian person they brought into the country to do that menial labor. They're the only ones. Those people are the only ones who are, and so those people, hey, just so happens they're the ones who are the biggest financial contributors to the campaigns of those racist right-wing politicians in Israel who are, pushing to kick out all the Africans. So someone is profiting off of this, if you can imagine. It's not only the racist motive. So there's that right-wing capitalist motive. But let's talk about, as you pointed out, the collaboration between the right wing in Israel and the right wing in the U.S. and the so-called contradiction of why to ally with white supremacists who aren't fond of Jewish people themselves. We see right after when Trump comes into power and he starts, Charlottesville, and he's like both sides. Oh, there's bad people on both sides, and he gets into all this criticism. What does he say to defend himself from accusations of not responding to anti-Semitism? He says, "You heard Netanyahu yesterday. He said, forget it." Okay, so he's using Netanyahu as his shield to protect him from accusations that he's not combating anti-Semitism. And now Netanyahu is the Jew shield, for white supremacists. Now, why are Israelis doing this? Because they have a common enemy. They see it this way. They see that for a short period of time, they have a temporary alliance with the far right. White supremacists. Why? Because they all hate immigration. They all hate Muslims. They all hate Arabs. They all hate brown people. They don't want any of the, they want, ethno states. So their vision is, and if you think about it, it actually dovetails with the far right in the U.S. If these white supremacists say, we don't want you Jews here. We want only white Christian folks here, let's say. Well, that dovetails with Zionists because Netanyahu also wants that. He says, we want all the Jewish people to come to Israel. We don't want the Jewish people to stay in America, just like the Nazis, just like the neo-Nazis, just like they don't want them in America. We don't want them either. We want all the Jews to come to Israel. So then, Israel will be 99.9% Jewish, and then we can, there'll be no non-Jews here. This is the idea where Zionists and white supremacists come together, both on their vision for the state and their vision for where Jewish people should be living. Should they have the right, like everyone else in the world, to live everywhere in the world? No. Zionists and white supremacists agree that all the Jews should be living in Israel and that all those states should be ethno states. So that's the reason for the collaboration, sickening as it is.
Wow. It's a lot to take in. As we close out, David Sheen, in your report, folks give solutions and make a request on how to really push to change this scenario. As you close out, can you share with folks that solution and also where people can find your in-depth reporting on this?
Sure. Okay. So, there was the video that I sent you earlier. That's a video in which African people themselves and members of other African communities in the country bonded together to make a political statement. It's actually the first time in the history of the country that people from all the different African communities here, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, etc., all came together to make a political statement. So in and of itself, it's quite amazing. But what they're saying is, look, this story has been censored by the mainstream media. Black Lives Matter folks in the U.S. who care about Black lives. Now, admittedly, you got to care first about your own Black lives that are, and the white supremacist facing and state-sponsored racism in the U.S. But the point is that, this story is not being told. And if it was being told, perhaps there would be some sympathy for them. And it isn't. So the people are asking, folks here are asking, share that on social media. Everyone's got a social media account. Share it with your community, with your friends, your family, and your decision makers and your community leaders, and tell them that this is even happening. And that video that I sent you, not only is it in their own words, but it also has dozens of links to mainstream media articles. So if you can't believe what you're hearing and seeing because you find it, no, there's no way this could be true. Well, it's all there. It's like baby food. It's been wrapped with a bow. Well, it's not just, you don't even have to do the homework. It's right there.
And it's not just it's all there. This policy of creating misery, has resulted in babies being killed and stabbed. And right there, you're like, you don't believe me? Click the link and here's the story. So it's been like nobody is safe. You could be a cute little kid. You could be a baby in a mother's arms. You could be a young man or a young adult. And you're going to, the gloves are off and people are coming for folks in ways that are savage.
Let me give you one sentence to go on. Imagine if you had Richard Spencer or like a KKK leader coming to Trump's cabinet meetings. That's what we have in Israel. The woman who's the head of the local KKK in Tel Aviv, and when I say that, I mean she and her allies patrol the streets of South Tel Aviv where there are African people, African neighborhoods, and she walks up to little kids telling them, get out of the country, screaming and yelling at them. Adults coming up to little kids if they see them playing in public parks, telling them to get the hell out of the country. Now, that same person who's the head of this gang that terrorizes little African kids in Tel Aviv, in liberal Tel Aviv, she is invited to Netanyahu's cabinet meetings. She sits in the cabinet meetings as his representative in South Tel Aviv, as the person to like bring him up to speed on what's happening. So that's how far gone it is, that there's no embarrassment even to be associated with the head of the local JJJ or KKK or whatever you want to call them. So the situation is dire. And
Wow.
Any help that people can have in putting it out would be much appreciated by those folks. And in terms of finding out more information, there's a lot of stuff out there. I've written a lot of it. Just davidsheen.com is a place where you can get links to dozens or hundreds even of articles and videos that I've written on the topic over the years. It's all very laid out. So that's one quick link that people could just remember my name, David Sheen, SHEDAVIDSHEEN.com.
David, thank you so much. We will be in touch. This is very disturbing, but hopefully people will take this to heart and, put some action in a direction that will lead to some sort of relief and liberation. So thank you so much, and we will talk to you soon.
All right, will do. Take care of yourself. Bye for now.
We're going to take a break on Hard Knock Radio. We'll be right back.